Mr. Anonymous and the Not-So-Spontaneous Birth of the Libertarian Movement. Written on October 6, 2007. Author unknown. Disclaimer. This is not a conspiracy story, though it has all the elements of one. Anonymous shady figures, international societies, complete political ideologies created for convenience alone, social institutions corrupted through the mere distribution of cash, science, politics, universities, governments, and even the Nobel Prize, and a global strategy designed to rule the world. No doubt about it, this one is better than a novel. But don't get carried away. There are no secret ceremonies or lizard people in this tale, nor is it a story about groups named after Italian light fixtures or German beer. It is instead the story of how everyday conspiracies work. Karl Marx wrote that the ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of its ruling class. Looking backward, it is hard to dispute this observation, but how does it actually work? That is what our story is about. It starts with the businessman below and his simple frustration at the success of Marxism as an idea, first among his own workers and then amongst the American establishment, whose widespread adoption of the appropriately conciliatory New Dealism was entirely in response. In an economic system in which everything is reduced to a commodity, a man of means should be able to simply buy a counter-idea, shouldn't he? So it turns out. Mr. Anonymous. William S. Volcker, 1859 to 1947, alias Mr. Anonymous, alias the first citizen of Kansas City, Missouri, quote, was an extremely modest, enormously wealthy home-furnishing tycoon. He became the unrecognizable donor of thousands of gifts, large and small, unquote. Volcker was born April 1, 1859 into a prosperous household in Hanover, Germany. At age 12, Volcker's family immigrated to Chicago. At 17, he went to work for a picture frame manufacturer. With the death of his employer in 1882, Volcker bought out the company and moved the enterprise to Kansas City. From there, his, quote, little window shade business, unquote, grew into a national giant. In 1911, 52-year-old William Volcker married. Returning from his honeymoon, he announced he had put $1 million in his wife's name and, he said, intended to give the rest of his enormous fortune away. Over the next 36 years, he donated millions of dollars, much of it anonymously. When Volcker died at the age of 88 on November 4, 1947, many schools, parks, and public spaces were named for the furnishing tycoon. So why pick on this guy? The answer is that the overwhelming priority of Volcker's, quote, philanthropy, unquote, was focused, not on public spaces, but on reactionary ideology. Dismayed by the rise of socialism in America, and doubly dismayed by what he saw as the evolution of government and political thinking towards accommodation and the, quote, new liberalism, unquote, eventually personified by the widespread adoption of the economic views of John Maynard Keynes and the New Deal policies of Franklin Roosevelt. Volcker set out to create a new and much more reactionary, quote, mainstream, unquote, ideology based loosely around his own ideas of, quote, laissez-faire, unquote, capitalism, i.e., a largely unregulated economy, and social Darwinism, the pseudo-scientific notion that in society, unhindered competition would allow the, quote, cream to rise to the top, unquote. In truth, Volcker was no great scholar or thinker. The ideology he set out to create was built upside down, starting only with a set of foggy conclusions for which he had a predisposition. From these conclusions, it was the task of Volcker's considerable fortune to find a set of justifications, then an enabling ideology or, quote, theory, unquote, that gave it all perspective and unity, and, eventually, a true philosophical platform from which to launch the whole. But if this task was analogous to building the Great Pyramid, starting from the top, Volcker was undaunted. He may not have had a brain, but he had money. and he had a personal connection to one of the most reactionary sections of that most reactionary of organizations, the National Association of Manufacturers. Volcker's, quote, associates, unquote, who would all participate closely included Jasper Crane of DuPont, B.E. Hutchinson of Chrysler, Henry Weaver of General Electric, Pierre Goodrich of B.F. Goodrich, and Richard Earhart of White Star Oil, which through many mergers and acquisitions would eventually become Mobile Oil. Moreover, Volcker had, quote, influence, unquote, at the leading scholarly institution in his hometown, the University of Chicago. Founded none other than by John D. Rockefeller, and created with a certain ideological, quote, bent, unquote. In 1932, Volcker established the William Volcker Fund, and, with that, started on the road to becoming perhaps the most significant anonymous asshole of our times. In every way, William S. Volcker was the true, quote, father, unquote, of libertarianism and modern conservatism. For the first dozen years, the fund largely floundered. There is some evidence that Volcker may have flirted with fascism. That ideology, though, which attracted such celebrities as Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, was thought to have a limited future in America. In the face of Keynesian economics, widespread social spending, and the CIO, what was really required was a return to pre-New Deal economic policy and an anti-communist/anti-union social policy. Eureka! The breakthrough came in 1944 when Volcker's nephew, Harald Lonau, took over. First the business and then the fund. In the same year, Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom was published. The book was a product of the, quote, Austrian School, unquote, of Economists, originating at the University of Vienna and first coming to modest prominence at the end of the 19th century in its attacks on Marxist and socialist economics. Hayek's book was an almost mystical and hysterical defense of laissez-faire capitalism and the, quote, free market, unquote. According to Hayek, market prices create a, quote, spontaneous order, or what is referred to as that which is the result of human action but not of human design. Thus, Hayek put the price mechanism on the same level as, for example, language, unquote. In turn, any attempt at regulation would inevitably lead to, quote, totalitarianism, unquote, and in this, both Marxist and the New Deal, quote, socialism, unquote, were essentially similar. The theory was perfect. Volcker and Lonau had found their ideology. Cash began to flow. In short, the Volcker Fund and its larger network arranged for the republication of Hayek's book by the University of Chicago, a recurring and important connection, despite the fact that it had been almost universally rejected by the economics establishment. A year later, the book was published in serial form by the ultra-reactionary Reader's Digest, notwithstanding the fact that it was supposed to be a, quote, scholarly text, unquote. Ordinarily inappropriate for the readership of the Digest, and despite the fact that it had also been panned by literary critics. In 1950, the fund arranged for Hayek to secure a position at the University of Chicago, and when the university only granted an unpaid position, they arranged for the Earhart Foundation to pay him a salary. Hayek was only the first of a veritable flood of émigrés, quote, scholars, unquote. Recruiting the homeless. Hayek's teacher in Vienna had been one Ludwig von Mises, who, in turn, had been the student of Eugene von Boehm-Bavinck, who had gained fame for his attack on Marxist economics, and who, in his turn, had been the student of Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School. Each of these had published several books that were virulent attacks on socialism and defended, quote, pure capitalism, unquote. It was all very good. Von Mises's book was called Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analyst, and it had been received with yawns when it was published in English in 1936. While von Mises really had, quote, taught, unquote, at the University of Vienna, his was an unpaid position. The university had turned him down on 4 separate occasions for a paid position. Not surprisingly, in 1940, the nearly destitute von Mises had immigrated to the United States. In 1945, an unpaid, quote, visiting professorship, unquote, was obtained for him at NYU, while his salary was paid by, quote, businessmen such as Lawrence Fertig, unquote. Fertig was an associate of the Volcker Fund and a friend of Henry Hazlitt, the fund's friendliest journalist. In all, they would fund von Mises for 25 years, and von Mises never would need a, quote, real job, unquote. In fact, this was typical of the fund's bait-and-switch tactic for developing resumes. In the United States, von Mises was a, quote, famed economics professor from the University of Vienna, unquote. In Europe, he would become the, quote, famous American economist from NYU, unquote. Local reinforcements. The economist Milton Friedman, during his 15 minutes of fame, took the opportunity of the publication of his opus, Capitalism and Freedom, to decry the shabby treatment that the likes of Hayek and Mises had received from the economics, quote, establishment, unquote. On his own similar reception, he wrote in the 1982 preface of his book, quote, those of us who were deeply concerned about the danger to freedom and prosperity from the growth of government, from the triumph of welfare state and Keynesian ideas, were a small, beleaguered minority, regarded as eccentrics by the great majority of our fellow intellectuals. Even 7 years later, when this book was first published, its views were so far of the mainstream that it was not reviewed by any major national publication, not by the New York Times or the Herald Tribune, then still being published in New York, or the Chicago Tribune, or by Time or Newsweek, or even the Saturday Reviewer, though it was reviewed by the London Economist and by the major professional journals. And this for a book directed at the general public, written by a professor at a major U.S. university, and destined to sell more than 400,000 copies in the next 18 years. Unquote. It is attractive to believe that Friedman was really this foolish, and that his expertise in the, quote, politics of fame, unquote, was similar to his expertise in monetary policy. In fact, his separate acknowledgments of the importance of the Volcker Fund belie this possibility. In truth, the fund and its progeny identified Friedman early on, shepherded his career at the University of Chicago, subsidized him through a paid lecture series, which eventually were combined into Capitalism and Freedom, paid his way to Mount Pearland, arranged for the serialization of his book by Reader's Digest, and bought a significant number of the books that Friedman was so proud of, quote, selling, unquote. Friedman was only one of the dozens of such local, quote, scholars, unquote, who were suddenly, quote, discovered, unquote, through the efforts of the fund. The fund also now began to recruit friendly young, quote, future scholars, unquote, and subsidize their development. Not only was the cause thus advanced, but a modest intelligence network became a part of the, quote, Libertarian movement, unquote. One such early recruit was Murray Rothbard, later became famous as the, quote, father, unquote, of, quote, left libertarianism, unquote, quote, libertarian anarchism, unquote, and, quote, Anarcho-Capitalism, unquote. Later much castigated for his, quote, sellout to the right-wing Republicans, unquote, Rothbard had, from the first, been intimately wrapped up in anti-communism, McCarthyism, the, quote, old right, unquote, and the right-wing ideology of the Volcker Fund. It was through the fund that he became an associate of Ayn Rand and a student of Mises. Quote, Rothbard began his consulting work for the Volcker Fund in 1951. This relationship lasted until 1962, when the VF was dissolved. A major part of Rothbard's work for the VF consisted of reading and evaluating books, journal articles, and other materials. On the basis of written reports by Rothbard and another reader, Rose Wilder Lane, the VF's directors would decide whether to undertake massive distribution of particular works to public libraries. The VF also asked Rothbard to submit reports on particular questions, such as how to rank sundry economists in terms of friendliness to the free market, surveys of the literature on monopoly, Soviet wage structures, etc., etc. Rothbard's memos numbered several hundred, covering works in economics, history, philosophy, and political science. The memos, which range in length from 1 page to 70 pages, provide a window into the scholarship of the period, and Rothbard's views on that scholarship. They thereby shed much light on Rothbard's emerging worldview and his systematic defense of liberty." Unquote. They also shed, quote, "much light," unquote, on how the fund decided which, quote, "scholars," unquote, to promote and which to attack. Rothbard later called his work with the Volcker Fund, quote, "the best job I've ever had in my life," unquote. Multiplying like rabbits. In support of the imported scholars and the new ideology, the Volcker Fund also pioneered a process which would become the hallmark of the, quote, "libertarian movement," unquote. The fund started to spin off organizations by the boatload, each intended not just to serve specific purposes, but to give the appearance of many, quote, "independent," unquote, efforts spawned by, quote, "mass," unquote, appeal. The list of, quote, "begets," unquote, is too numerous to chronicle, but the first set are illuminating. Among the very first, quote, "front organizations," unquote, of the Volcker Fund was the, quote, "National Book Foundation," unquote. While the foundation's affiliation to the Volcker Fund was not hidden, it was circumspect enough to suggest, even to most, quote, "libertarians," unquote, that it was independent. The fund began modestly enough by distributing free copies of Eugene Boehm Bulwerk's works to thousands of libraries and universities across the country. As the Volcker efforts geared up, the foundation began to distribute millions of books from dozens of authors, all coming from the fund's stables. Many educational, quote, "incentives," unquote, were initiated, such as, quote, "teach a course on Hayek, get 10 or 100 textbooks for free," unquote. The Foundation for Economic Education was spun out in 1946 under the leadership of Leonard Read, a leading figure in the chambers of commerce. The granddaddy of all libertarian, quote, "think tanks," unquote. The FEE initiated the original Mount Pelerin Society meetings. Its own publication, The Freeman, became the founding of, quote, "libertarianism," unquote. The rent was paid by Volcker. The Institute for Humane Studies was created by Floyd Baldy Harper, the, quote, "ace recruiter," unquote, of the Volcker Fund, in 1961. The IHS identified and subsidized, quote, "bright young students," unquote, and, quote, "promising scholars," unquote, friendly to the new, quote, "libertarian," unquote, doctrine. Not only did the IHS fund thousands of, quote, "students," unquote, but it spawned dozens of similar organizations throughout the world. After the Volcker Fund was finally closed, subsidies for the IHS shifted to some of the most reactionary organizations in America: the Scaife Foundation, Koch Family Foundations, the Bradley Foundation, and the Carthage Foundation. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute was founded in 1953 to combat what they would eventually call, quote, "political correctness," unquote, and, quote, "left bias," unquote, in colleges and universities. The organization now consists of 50,000 college students and faculty, and through its lavish subsidies, sponsors dozens of programs representing the entire spectrum of right-wing, quote, "libertarian," unquote, causes. The first president of the ISI was a young William F. Buckley, Jr. The Earhart Foundation was created by and named for Richard Earhart of White Star Oil, one of Volcker's original collaborators in the National Association of Manufacturers. This foundation was used to subsidize various immigrants and not only finance Hayek, but also Erich Voegelin, yet another, quote, "Austrian," unquote. Through Voegelin, the Earhart Foundation became connected with the infamous Leo Strauss, and, since then, various, quote, "projects," unquote, of not just the, quote, "libertarian," unquote, but of a, quote, neoconservative, unquote, perspective have been beneficiaries of the foundation. In addition, the Earhart Foundation helped pioneer still another use of the newly emergent libertarian think tanks. As the network of these think tanks grew, they undertook not only to promote ideology, but also specific points of policy, particularly in support of private corporations. The culmination of the Foundation's efforts in this direction came with the founding of the George C. Marshall Institute in 1984. The Institute was initially a foremost proponent of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, heavily promoted by the defense industry, and later became the leading non-industry critic of, quote, climate change, unquote. The CEO of the Institute is currently a registered lobbyist of ExxonMobil. Through the list of organizations above, the Volcker Fund's near-biblical, quote, begets, unquote, encompass nearly every single prominent individual and organization of the, quote, libertarian, unquote, and, quote, new conservative, unquote, movements of today. The Not-So-Secret Society. Quote, in 1947, 39 scholars, mostly economists, with some historians and philosophers, were invited by Professor Friedrich Hayek to meet at Mount Perlian, Switzerland, and to discuss the state and possible fate of classical liberalism, and to combat the state ascendancy and Marxist or Keynesian planning sweeping the globe. Invites included Henry Simmons, who would later train Milton Friedman, a future president of the society, at the University of Chicago, the American former Fabian socialist Walter Lippmann, Vietnamese Aristotelian society leader Karl Popper, fellow Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises, Sir John Claflin, a senior official of the Bank of England who, from 1940 to 1946, was the president of the British Royal Society, Otto von Habsburg, the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, and Max von Thurn und Taxis, Bavaria-based head of the 400-year-old Venetian Thurn and Taxis family, unquote. If the above rings of, quote, Bohemian Grove, unquote, and similar fodder for conspiracies, it is because informal, quote, retreats, unquote, at out-of-the-way resorts are one of the favorite methods by which the wealthy of many countries formulate a common international policy. What distinguishes the Mount Perelin Society, however, is that it did not consist primarily of the wealthy. Instead, it was comprised of a majority of marginal, threadbare, quote, scholars, unquote, united only by their common hatred of, quote, socialism, unquote, and Keynesianism, which were one and the same for most of them, and sprinkled with only a handful of rich patrons and journalists. In fact, the Mount Perelin Society was organized as much by the Volcker Fund as by Hayek himself, and the foundation paved the way for all 10 of the American, quote, participants, unquote. Once in Switzerland, the, quote, scholars, unquote, agreed on their hatred of, quote, socialism, unquote, but on little else except to meet yearly to, quote, facilitate an exchange of ideas between like-minded scholars in the hope of strengthening the principles and practice of a free society and to study the workings, virtues, and defects of market-oriented economic systems, unquote. From this not-so-secret but thoroughly right-wing society's more than humble beginnings, the phoenix of laissez-faire capitalism would rise, propelled skyward by unlimited funds. Over a dozen of the scholars who could not previously get a job, a review, or a book deal would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. This, quote, epic, unquote, story will be told separately. More importantly, the Mount Perelin Society would itself beget 500 foundations and organizations in nearly 80 countries. Again, with strategic contributions from Mr. Anonymous. Once transformed into a, quote, international movement, unquote, there was no end to what was possible. One example tells the story. Initiated at Mount Perelin and copying the FEE, the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA, was created in London in 1955, serving as a conduit for both cash and, quote, ideas, unquote. The IEA set about the task of, quote, rejuvenating, unquote, the dead and decaying British Tories. By 1985, the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher would positively gush on the occasion of the Institute's 30th anniversary. Quote, You create the atmosphere which made our victory possible. May I say how thankful we are to those who joined your great endeavor. They were the few, but they were the right, and they saved Britain." Unquote. With that, the IEA begat the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, which in turn created a network of over 50, quote, think tanks, unquote, in more than 30 countries. And what were the scale of these efforts? John Blundell, the head of the IEA, in a speech to the Heritage Foundation and Atlas in 1990, would identify a rare failure in the Society's efforts. Shaking his head at the abortive attempt to subsidize academic, quote, shares of free enterprise, unquote, in dozens of countries throughout the world, Blundell complained about wasting, quote, hundreds of millions, perhaps $1 billion, unquote. This was just one initiative among many. Oceans of cash. Aaron Director was a lawyer and Ukrainian immigrant whose sister had married Milton Friedman prior to the Second World War. That then became the connection which led to the Volcker Fund's subsidy of Director and his association with the University of Chicago. He was one of the fund's, quote, imports, unquote, alongside von Mises. Director's collaborator at the university was Edward Levi, who would eventually go on to become the president of the university and then the Attorney General of the United States. Together, Director and Levi were instrumental in the development of the Chicago School of Economics, or the conquest by the Economics Department of the School of Business and the Law School. The Law School? What does law have to do with economics? The answer was everything, according to Director, who developed the theory of, quote, law and economics, unquote, called, without tongue-in-cheek, the L&E, quote, movement, unquote, stressing free enterprise principles and the primacy of property law, as well as measuring legal rulings with longer-term economic criteria. Quote, he founded the Journal of Law and Economics in 1958. That helped to unite the fields of law and economics with far-reaching influence, unquote. The journal was, of course, funded in large part by what had now become a substantial network of Volcker affiliates. Despite the fact that he himself wrote virtually nothing throughout his career, quote, Director influenced a generation of jurists, including Robert Bork, Richard Posner, Antonin Scalia, and Chief Justice William Rehnquist, unquote. John M. Olin. One of what made such a thing possible was not just new territories to which sell the tired old, quote, economic, unquote, ideas, but also new benefactors who spread the message far and wide. In this case, perhaps the most important new, quote, convert, unquote, was the munitions magnate John M. Olin and his foundation. Quote, John M. Olin was disturbed by a building takeover at his alma mater, Cornell University. At the age of 80, he decided that he must pour his time and resources into preserving the free market system that had allowed him to acquire his own wealth. The foundation is most notable for its early support and funding of the law and economics movement, a discipline that applies incentive-based thinking and cost-benefit analysis to the field of legal theory. Olin believed that law schools had a disproportionately large impact on society, given their size, and to this end, decided to focus the majority of his funding there, unquote. Between 1969 and 2005, when the foundation disbanded, the John M. Olin Foundation dispersed no less than $370 million, quote, primarily to conservative think tanks, media outlets, and law programs at influential universities. The foundation is most notable for its early support and funding of the law and economics movement, unquote. But that was not the only thing that the Olin Foundation promoted. Through its contacts at the University of Chicago, the Olin Foundation ran into political science professor Leo Strauss. Quote, Strauss taught that liberalism in its modern form contained within it an intrinsic tendency towards relativism, which in turn led to two types of nihilism. Epilogue. The first was a brutal nihilism expressed in Nazi and Marxist regimes. These ideologies, both descendants of Enlightenment thought, tried to destroy all traditions, history, ethics, and moral standings and replace it by force with the supreme authority under which nature and mankind are subjugated and conquered. The second type, the gentle nihilism expressed in Western liberal democracies, was a kind of value-free aimlessness and hedonism, which he saw as permeating the fabric of contemporary American society, and believed that 20th century relativism, scientism, historicism, and nihilism were all implicated in the deterioration of modern society and philosophy. Strauss sought to uncover the philosophical pathways that had led to this situation. The resultant study led him to revive classical political philosophy as a source by which political action could be judged." Unquote. Well, it was not exactly the same thing, but it was close enough. And, with its further evolution, quote, neoliberalism, unquote, would abandon the, quote, classical liberals, unquote, in favor of medieval scholars, thus coming much closer to a, quote, synergy, unquote. Meanwhile, for both, quote, classical political philosophy, unquote, was, of course, synonymous with political reaction. The unmentioned irony was that the critique of Straussianism, that it was, quote, crudely anti-democratic, obsessed with secret meetings and in love with white lies told by powerful men to keep the rabble in line, unquote, applied neatly as a summation of the, quote, classical liberalism, unquote, or, quote, libertarian, unquote, movement as a whole. In addition to its libertarian mission, the Olin Foundation became a founder and one of the principal funding sources of the Project for the New American Century, PNAC. Extending their reach, the inheritors of Mr. Anonymous's legacy also set about creating umbrella organizations for libertarian funding sources dedicated to funding the, quote, counterintelligentsia, unquote. These extended from newly created, shadowy, and, quote, anonymous, unquote, foundations to the famous think tanks such as Cato, Hoover, and Hudson, to the infamous, such as the Scaife Foundation. As the network had grown, the financing of, quote, scholars, unquote, has been supplemented by the adoption of campaigns, not just in the name of, quote, capitalism, unquote, quote, freedom, unquote, and, quote, liberty, unquote, in general, but on behalf of individual capitalists in particular. Today, there is virtually no public campaign against anti-tobacco legislation, against environmental legislation, rejecting climate change theory, on behalf of HMOs and private healthcare, against pharmaceutical regulation, and so on, outside of industry and trade associations that does not originate within the network created or touched by Mr. Anonymous. Today, the size of the cash flow is not counted in millions, or hundreds of millions, or in billions, but in tens of billions, and perhaps even more. But what about, quote, ideas, unquote? In our search for cash and connections without parallel, it might be argued that we have missed a, quote, great ideas, unquote, of libertarianism. The simple explanation is that there are none. Beyond the pro forma agreement on the evils of Marxism, Keynesianism, and, quote, big government, unquote, and the thoroughly mystical, near-religious belief in capitalism and, quote, free markets, unquote, reduced to paper-thin slogans such as, quote, personal freedom, unquote, and, quote, individual liberty, unquote, there is no other point of consensus. Pressed beyond such plateaus, the, quote, theoreticians, unquote, of this, quote, movement, unquote, have always descended into the most bitter disagreements about the most substantial of issues. Such might easily be suspected of, quote, an ideology, unquote, that embraces a political spectrum which includes right-wing Republicans, and neoconservatives and neoliberals, and neo-fascist Ayn Randians, and, quote, classical liberals, unquote, and Libertarian Party members, and, quote, anarchist, unquote. The economic historian, Jamie Peck, in setting out to write a history of the theories of the Austrian school, was dismayed to find that he could not find a, quote, aha moment, unquote, in that history, nor could he see substantial points of agreement between any of the authors, beyond the obvious, nor could he detect a coherent point of view that remained constant amongst any one of them for long. Quote, there was nothing spontaneous about neoliberalism. It was speculatively planned, it was opportunistically built, and it has been repeatedly reconstructed, unquote, wrote Peck. We will deal with the subject in accompanying material, but for the moment, it should be said that even the above misses the point. Beyond congenital disagreements, the embrace of libertarian economics as political slogan from the beginning meant that the, quote, science, unquote, and it is only as, quote, economic science, unquote, that the ideology has ever had even nominal roots, was stillborn, no matter how miserable its stock and trade may have turned out to be. Hayek said as much at the time of his, quote, Nobel Prize, unquote. He complained that serfdom had ended his, quote, career, unquote, as a, quote, economist, unquote, and implied that it began his life as a, quote, ideologist, unquote. No matter what illusions he may have harbored as to his own, quote, destiny, unquote, the comment passes down to us as the complaints of a paid shill of the real libertarian, quote, science, unquote. The science of propaganda, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Volcker Fund, with Hayek only counting as just another whiny paid professional complaining about his job title. There is no evidence that the much larger irony ever occurred to Hayek. Tens, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of books, hundreds of journals, dozens of universities, tens of thousands of people, and thousands of professorships, and so on in a network touching virtually everyone in the, quote, Western democracies, unquote. All of it centrally planned, all of it subsidized, none of it capable of existing by itself in the commercial marketplace or in the, quote, marketplace of ideas, unquote, and all of it failing dozens of times until hooked into the river of cash produced by the simple subsidies of the rich designed to derail the, quote, free, unquote, evolution of ideas as they were actually proceeding. Is there any such example in all of human history of a, quote, movement, unquote, so far at odds with its own self-proclaimed, quote, principles, unquote? No problem, though for William S. Volcker, for whom, quote, belief, unquote, was always optional, Mr. Anonymous got exactly what he paid for. For anyone who would attempt to understand class societies, the unmediated slogans of those same societies are the worst possible places to begin. For feudal societies, slogans such as chivalry, honor, fealty, chastity, virtue, and the like underlay a social fabric that was monstrous, arbitrary, and treacherous. In most cases, the slogans hit social truths which were the exact opposite of their rhetorical claims. The cruelty of the joke was not fully apparent until the end times of feudalism itself, or perhaps even after. In our own times, the slogans which have replaced these are those of freedom, liberty, democracy, enterprise, individuality, and so on. It is impossible to know the meaning of these as given, and even more unlikely that one may make of them as one may wish. In the present society, they are like virgin forests that one may stumble upon while walking, no matter how pristine and unfettered such may appear. In our contemporary social system, that forest is inevitably someone's private property, and is thus absolutely resistant to any other appropriation. So too is the same with, quote, freedom, unquote, and, quote, liberty, unquote. No matter how one may, quote, choose, unquote, to think of them, in truth, they have only one source and one meaning. The current stakeholder for those terms is the anonymous asshole above, William Volcker. He mined the ore, refined the technique, processed the product, and merchandised the result, finally sending the finished commodity out on rivers of cash, no less than Henry Ford did with his automobiles. As with all other industrial barons of his time, that he knew nothing of the actual ideas, processes, and practices meant nothing at all. He bought them, he paid for them, he owned them, and in the process, he spawned the liberty industry, a multi-billion-dollar monopoly which today owns, quote, the marketplace of ideas, unquote. So too, just as with Ford, the complete legacy of his, quote, works, unquote, becomes apparent only now. A postscript. As far as a postscript goes, we end as we began, with yet more fodder for conspiracy theorists. The William S. Volcker Fund closed-up shop in 1974 secured in the fact that its, quote, mission, unquote, had been taken up by others. The last millions in the fund were passed on to the ultra-conservative Hoover Institution. What were not passed on were the files of the Volcker Fund, which mysteriously disappeared. The entire paper trail documenting where the money had come from, how it was spent, and who was, quote, touched, unquote, by it. All of this disappeared with a, quote, poof, unquote. 3 decades after he died, Volcker seems to have guaranteed his anonymity into perpetuity, and to this day, nothing but the vague outlines of this story are known. And so it goes.